atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Josh Cowan, professor of education policy at Michigan State University. Today we'll be talking about his recently released book, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Josh Cowan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought we'd get really basic to start with, just to make sure everyone understands. Can you just briefly explain what exactly school voucher programs are in general?
Yeah, so vouchers are kind of an umbrella term for any taxpayer funding that goes to private school tuition for K-12 in particular. So there's been quite a number of different mechanical ways that policymakers have designed these voucher systems over the last 30 years. But at their core, what we're talking about here are any sort of program that uses taxpayer funding to pay for private school tuition.
And if I did a little research on this before we talked, not just reading your book, but according to analysis I saw on Education Week, there are 29 states as well as D.C. that have at least one sort of private school choice program, which I guess would fit under that umbrella. And I'm wondering, do you think that number is likely to increase, or is this sort of education choice movement, which is oftentimes I think what proponents call it, is it something that you feel has sort of peaked at this point?
Well, there's no question that over the last 2 years, voucher versions of these choice programs have reached a peak so far. So over the last 2 years, more than 20 states have created or expanded a voucher system. And again, when we're talking about vouchers, what we're talking about are taxpayer funds for private school. There are, as you mentioned, quite a number of other choice type programs. That vouchers are different than charter schools. They're different than choice processes for parents to send their kid to a neighboring district. Those are all different types of school choice programs. But when we're talking about vouchers, certainly over the last couple of years, we haven't seen as many states at once pass these types of private tuition plans.
And what I didn't one of the many things I learned from reading your book is I had no idea of really kind of the deeper history of vouchers. To me, I always thought it was more or less a fairly recent thing. But like for instance, Milton Friedman, I knew who Milton Friedman is, of course, but I had no idea that he was sort of a pioneer in this area. And so I was hoping we could go way back to Milton Friedman's time, and maybe you could talk a little bit about his view of vouchers.
Yeah, so Milton Friedman is actually kind of the godfather of the school voucher idea. Friedman was an economist based at the University of Chicago, a conservative economist based at the University of Chicago, who first came up with the idea of vouchers actually in 1955. Something else was going on in 1955, just a few months before Friedman published his voucher idea. The Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation was unconstitutional. And it was, of course, a school segregation case that the court ruled on. And segregationists looking to avoid the court's order immediately seized on Milton Friedman's idea as a way to create kind of a separate private school system that parents could opt into using a voucher, a publicly funded voucher, but a private system to sort of avoid the court's integration orders. Now, there's some debate about whether Friedman himself was a segregationist. I fall in the camp, and if you've read the book, I sort of talk about this, drawing on recent histories of Friedman. I fall into the camp where it sort of doesn't matter what Friedman's own personal views were. The point here is that segregationists immediately jumped on Friedman's idea to try to avert Brown. But vouchers themselves didn't really kind of become in modern form part of the policy landscape until 1990. And then that's when conservatives in Wisconsin, but soon after in Cleveland, Ohio, started to create trial voucher programs based on Friedman's idea. And Friedman was very active in the voucher advocacy space from 1990 until his death in 2006. So, certainly it's important to start with Friedman as the kind of godfather of vouchers. It's also important to note, though, that when he published his first voucher idea, this was going on in a very difficult political time in American history, and that was the court's desegregation order and segregationists' attempt to fight racial integration in public schools.
And it seems to me, if I understand the basic concept behind vouchers, I think a lot of people, well, especially maybe right libertarian folks, would have a lot of sympathy, because the idea, as I understand it, is basically that public schools have essentially a monopoly on K through 12 education. And when you have monopolies, what that means is you typically get poor service, you get not so much innovation. And while we've always had a system in which if you have more means, if you're a wealthier family, you can opt out by sending your kid to a private school. Without vouchers, there's no way for less well-advantaged families to do that. And so they're stuck in this underperforming, non-innovative monopoly. That, to me, at least, is the case that voucher proponents make, or at least that I hear them making. And I'm wondering, when you hear that case made, which I'm sure you've had a bunch of times, is there anything that rings true to you in that?
Well, it's important to know that, first of all, 70% of voucher users in states across the country were already in private school to begin with. So in today's kind of modern voucher push, where we're talking about these expanded universal voucher programs here, like those that have been passed in the last 2 years, we're talking about voucher systems that are available to everyone, regardless of income. So that's not only lower income families, but also wealthier families who are already in private school to begin with. And indeed, 70% of voucher users, again, were already in private school to begin with, at least in these modern forms. So it's certainly true that 30 years ago, in 1990, in the mid-90s in Cleveland, in 1990 in Milwaukee, these were means-tested programs. And what we mean by that in the policy community is these are programs that had income caps. So if you made over a certain amount of money, these voucher systems weren't available to you. They were targeted programs to help specifically with kids who were struggling in certain public schools. And indeed, in those early programs, you had to actually be in a public school that had been rated low on an academic report card to even be eligible, in addition to the income piece. But today, there's certainly a lot of rhetoric around that still, the so-called failing public schools. But that's just rhetoric. The reality is that, again, 70% of voucher users are already in private school. And, it's important to understand, too, that given the academic track record of vouchers, to the extent that they have in the last decade or so served lower income families, they have had catastrophic impacts on those kids' academic outcomes. And so this is why I call school vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending. It sounds great. It sounds like we just give everybody a coupon and they can leave the school they want and go find another school. But you have to remember that vouchers, when it comes to vouchers, it's not actually school choice. It's the school's choice. None of the new voucher bills or policies in place will require any private school to take any child they don't want to. So you're given the voucher, but then you're on your own to go find a spot for a school that will take your child. And overwhelmingly, the schools that have space for those kids are what I call subprime schools. They're not any good. And the results show for that. The better private schools, and many do exist, the better private schools are already full. There's no room at the inn for new kiddos. And that's why 70% of voucher users were already in private school to begin with.
Because I guess measuring outcomes can be tricky depending on how you go about. When I see stuff from voucher advocates or educational choice advocates more generally, they can always seem to pull out data that shows that, my God, kids who move from these failing public schools do a lot better on average. But again, that, I guess to me, that seems like it involves a certain amount of cherry picking and other kind of manipulating the data in a way that maybe is a little less than entirely fair-minded, I guess.
Yeah. And, schools can decline kids for any reason. I'm glad you brought up the academic side. Of course, different parents value different types of educational outcomes. There's not just academics. There's school discipline. There's safety. One of the arguments that voucher advocates will make is, for some parents, they want religious education first and foremost. They don't. All the academic stuff is secondary, and they want the state to pay for that type of religious education instead of an academic-based education. The problem with all of this is, again, we go back to this issue, this so-called failing public schools issue. As long as we're going to use test scores to measure public schools, then we ought to be asking how voucher schools are doing on the same metric if the whole point of vouchers is to help kids leave failing public schools. If we're going to say that the whole point of vouchers is to help kids leave failing public schools, we ought to ask, are those children being better served once they leave those so-called failing public schools? So, folks like me, we're simply saying, listen, we can have a debate about test scores, but let's talk about, as long as test scores are the coin of the realm that we're going to use to judge public school activity, and we're going to try to use low public test scores to lure kids out of public schools, then the first thing we ought to check is whether or not they're reading as well and they're being able to do math as well and so on and so forth once they leave those public schools.
It seems to me that you wouldn't want to take overall averages, but you'd want to say if there's a bunch of kids who had low test scores and ended up using vouchers to go to another school, you ideally would want to track those exact same kids and compare the differences in their scores, right? But I guess that would be problematic for a lot of reasons.
Well, and that's what has happened over the last decade. Up until the last couple of years, there were regular evaluations, school-based report cards and things like that for both public and for taxpayer-funded private schools through vouchers. But as the results have come in over the last decade and shown just how dreadful vouchers have performed on those measures, the latest bills have sort of stripped voucher programs with anything resembling public school accountability. It's just simply a wash. And the idea that the voucher lobby has here is just to simply say, as long as parents are choosing, we don't need to know what the results are. As long as parents are fine with it, we don't need to know what the results are. And, there's some logic to that, but then you ought to apply it backward to public schools too and say, as long as parents are choosing public schools, then we shouldn't look too. I happen to think that if you're using public dollars, we need to have some oversight and to make sure schools are doing what they're claiming to do, whether they're public or private. But that has certainly not been the trend for recent voucher laws.
Yeah, and I'm curious about that lack of improvement, because, it seems to me in a system that is working like proponents would expect it to work, what you would have is parents use vouchers. They take kids out of what they feel to be underperforming public schools. And then, the public schools have to respond to that by sort of upping their game to compete, because now they are competing. But by the same token, then the private schools or the voucher schools also have to do better to try to pull in these students. And so competition should make, at least theoretically, should make both private schools and public schools better. And yet what I'm picking up on is that hasn't happened. And I'm wondering, why not?
Well, to the extent there's any sort of silver lining in all this dark cloud of voucher bills being passed, we have seen that in certain public school communities, when they are threatened with severe funding loss, they're able to push the children left in those communities a little harder, and you get a few test scores that are bumped up. Those are the so-called competitive effects that you're talking about. But those competitive threats are only present in sort of the research on this question in districts that, again, are threatened with severe funding loss, and in particular districts that have high rates of low-income families and high rates of communities of color. So at some point, you have to ask, is it moral public policy to threaten already under-resourced communities with even more funding loss to create this competitive effect, particularly when we know that directly investing in those communities has far bigger payoff academically and in later in life outcomes like higher wages, less likelihood to enter the criminal justice system, and so on. just directly using public dollars to invest in those communities and their public schools has far larger effects than anything we've seen in sort of the competitive effects research piece of this. So if the question is just let's improve public schools, okay, then let's just directly invest in them rather than kind of going this roundabout way to threaten them with severe funding cuts and maybe sort of get a small bump up in a test score for a short period of time. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And in no other, again, I want to stress that the results of leaving a public school and going to a voucher school for those low-income families are catastrophic. The academic impact of making that switch is some of the largest negative impacts we've ever seen on any question in the research literature. And so to make the competitive argument, what you're basically saying is, well, this particular medicine is going to make some of the patients who use it severely ill and maybe even kill some of them. But, there'll be some side effects in the general public who don't take the medication that seem okay. We wouldn't do that with public health, and we shouldn't do that in public education.
And you mentioned earlier, at least were kind of referred to earlier, the idea that it might not just be academic reasons why parents might want to pull their kids out of a public school. For instance, nowadays, putting the religious thing aside for a minute, there are parents who are concerned that the schools are teaching a so-called woke agenda. And so they see vouchers as a way to get their kids out of schools that are indoctrinating them in some sort of progressive liberalism. And also, I guess, to send a message to the public schools to say, stop pushing this sort of woke agenda. What do you think about that line of argument?
Well, it's absolutely part of why vouchers have spread. Okay, so one of the central pieces of the privateers, my book, is, again, over the last decade, as voucher academic results have come in and just been absolutely catastrophic, the kind of big conservative forces pushing these bills almost needed a new justification. And it's no accident that these terrible voucher academic results started to land and become well publicized nationally during the early Trump years, when at the same time we were hearing new attacks on LGBTQ Americans, new fights about bathrooms and then this issue of so-called critical race theory in schools and the woke agenda that you're describing. And now you have Ron DeSantis going out there, as he did a year ago, and saying, and defending a public education curriculum that included lessons suggesting slavery had benefits to African Americans because they learned certain skills during slavery. At the same time, Ron DeSantis is pushing the largest voucher scheme in the country. These are tied together. They're part of these larger political forces going on in this country. And the other thing I would just simply say is that many of the most important influencers in right-wing politics today have been very clear that this kind of woke the so-called woke agenda is something they're partly manufacturing to create vouchers, to create universal distrust in public schools. The right-wing influencer Christopher Rufo said this at a speech at Hillsdale College, not actually that far from where I am right now. He said, listen, to get universal school vouchers, we need to create universal distrust in public schools. And one way to do that is by attacking them on issues of race and gender and so on and so forth. This is why, by the way, in Project 2025, two of the first three paragraphs in the education chapter of Project 2025 call for school vouchers, and they do so nestled between new demands on the teaching of race in schools, the teaching of gender in schools, what they call so-called gender ideology. Like, there's a lot of buzzwords and code words that go along with these voucher bills. And so when we're talking about them in a vacuum, it may sound like this nice market-driven idea, but it's really important to understand vouchers as part of this larger right-wing political movement that's going on in this country right now.
I guess I wonder if I'm a parent and my concern is about a woke progressive gender, any sort of indoctrination of my kids, it seems to me that the way to deal with that more directly would be just to go to school board meetings, get involved in that when those decisions on curriculum are being made, as opposed to this sort of convoluted workaround sort of thing that seems a lot more administratively difficult. You see what I'm saying here, right?
You do see some effort in school boards, in book bans, in certain communities for parents, groups of conservative parents mobilizing to try to strip libraries from certain school books, curriculum fights at school boards and things. You do see some of the efforts to fight the so-called woke stuff in those public school communities. But again, a lot of this comes down to the fact that most of the folks who do care about these things already are in private school. They have been in private school for some period of time. The data reflect this. 70% of voucher users are already in private school. So to the extent that there are folks who are still very angry about all of these kind of so-called woke issues and things like that, most of them have left public schools or never were there in the first place. And then there are some, agitators that kind of come in and argue about these issues. And listen, this is what democracy is to some extent. You argue about things, you have elections, including school boards, and people can have conversations about what should or shouldn't be taught in public schools. But, they still have to, public schools are still the centers of most communities. People are very invested in them. And, I think it's important to kind of recognize that to the extent that the real goal here isn't about what is or isn't taught in public schools, but at the national level, the big sort of conservative forces pushing this stuff, they really are talking about just standing up an entirely separate sector of private schools, particularly private religious schools, and moving on from there.
There's a very cynical read of all this that has nothing to do with kids or education. I'm going to lay it out, at least one way of looking at it. I want to get your reaction. It's that teachers' unions are overwhelmingly Democratic in support. Something like 94% of all their donations go to Democratic candidates or support. And certainly they're the kind of on-the-ground grassroots support for a lot of Democratic candidates. And so some people look at this whole movement and say, well, this is just another way that conservative forces are trying to minimize the impact of public sector unions by defunding them, by making them weaker. And so it's really not about kids at all, or at least that's just a minor thing. Is that too cynical of a way to look at it? What do you think?
No. It certainly is not about kids, first and foremost. And listen, the connecting line between the Christian nationalism of a billionaire like Betsy DeVos and the kind of secular libertarianism of a billionaire like Charles Koch, who also has got big money in the voucher push. The through line between those two groups is deep hatred of unions, number one. Number two, if we're going to talk money, let's talk money. So Betsy DeVos's organization, it's a group called American Federation for Children, laughably named. CNN did a big piece of investigative journalism this spring, published a couple months ago, and they got a hold of an investor slide deck there that in which Betsy DeVos' organization said, listen, we've already spent $250 million since 2013 to push vouchers through. And we've gotten back $25 billion in public funding for vouchers. This is not, left-wing media. This is Betsy DeVos' own organization with these numbers. That means that for every dollar Betsy DeVos and her billionaire groups have put into lobbying for these things, they've gotten back $100 in taxpayer funding for private school tuition. So, every time sort of we talk about the unions and things like this, listen, yes, the unions, the teachers' unions are important, meaningful political players in education and in American politics, sure. But they're dwarfed by the impact of people like Betsy DeVos, people like Charles Koch, and other billionaires. And so I would just simply say, if you're sort of hearing a lot about unions, what are we talking about? We're talking about a profession that's 85% women still. So we're talking about organizations of mostly women who are standing up for public schools, standing up for their own jobs, by the way, and standing up for kids in their communities. And they are mobilized against these kind of billionaires like Betsy DeVos, who's never been in public school herself, sent all of her kids to private school, and has spent some of those billions to try to win taxpayer funding. So the money thing, it's kind of, it is what it is. But we want to talk dollars. Let's talk about all the right wing dollars that are going into this.
And just for folks who don't know, Betsy DeVos isn't just some random rich person. She was the Secretary of Education in the Trump administration, and presumably, should Donald Trump get reelected, if not Betsy DeVos, someone who shares many of her views would likely be in that position, right?
Right. Well, Betsy DeVos is certainly was the education secretary under Trump, and you're right. She's been a very, very important political player in Republican Party politics for, again, almost 30 years. Listen, we talk about there's a DeVos Center at the Heritage Foundation, the authors of Project 2025. Betsy DeVos is two-time chairwoman of the Republican State Party here in Michigan, my state. So these are very influential donors, and they expect, in Betsy DeVos's own words, they expect a return on their investment in these donations.
What do you, while we're on unions, what do you think about the argument that we often hear from the right that, well, teachers unions care more about protecting teacher tenure and prerogatives and all that, and make it harder to fire teachers, and so the real problem is the unions, and if we could just get rid of the unions or break their power, then we could have public schools that are more accountable, because the teachers would be held accountable for poor performance in a way that they're not now. At least that's the version of the argument I tend to hear, and I wanted to get your response to that.
Well, I would say if we're going to talk about accountability, let's talk about accountability for voucher systems, right? Like, over the last decade, we've seen some of the worst results for private schools taking taxpayer money that we've ever seen on any question, dwarfing anything that the public schools have done, on par with what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores in Louisiana, or what COVID-19's pandemic did itself to test scores in the last couple of years. And this is why the voucher lobby is pushing back against any type of accountability and oversight here. So, if we're going to have a conversation about what unions do or don't do on public school accountability, let's start with the fact that all of the recent voucher laws passed in the last couple of years have stripped away any type of accountability for private schools. And the reason for that is they see the same results I do. This isn't controversial. We all knew this. It's a fairly small community of folks studying this stuff. And, the results are dreadful. So, listen, I'd be happy to entertain questions about how to make public schools more accountable for results in a question about vouchers, as long as we're also talking about how to make vouchers more accountable to the parents who are lured away from public schools with them.
And, on the left, I think there are a lot of concerns that we have on the left about school choice and voucher programs, but one is that a lot of these voucher funds seem to end up going to religious schools. And so, okay, technically, voucher programs aren't subsidies to religion. It seems to me you can make an argument that in reality, that sort of is. And so there are people who say, wait a second. So in a sense, taxpayer money is being funneled into religious education. And what are your thoughts on that argument?
At this point in time, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that it is constitutional to use taxpayer dollars to fund religious education, not just religious schools, but religious education. And they made that ruling 2 years ago, 3 days before the same 6 right-wing justices also stripped away 50 years of precedent to remove a federal right to reproductive autonomy for half the people in this country. And we're talking, of course, about the rollbacks to Roe versus Wade. 3 days after the Supreme Court said it's okay to use taxpayer funding through vouchers to fund religious education. So we are in this moment where, some of the effort in this country on the right to make America a Christian nationalist state is getting some ground, up to and including the steps of the Supreme Court. So I don't think it's right. I think the evidence is dreadful on vouchers themselves, but it's absolutely true that vouchers are part of this larger effort among the religious right to make public policy favorable to a far right interpretation of Christianity, and that's where we are. So yes, people are using taxpayer funding at this point for religious education. That is an express goal of the voucher movement, and they have some allies up to and including the Supreme Court.
Do you think that there is conceivably any legitimate role for voucher programs? Like, for instance, as they started out, as we talked about earlier on, maybe limiting them only to low income, at risk kids and only for schools that have sort of repeatedly shown that they cannot meet or good educational outcomes?
Yes. So listen, vouchers are in many states, and in many of those states, they're not going away. So it's an important question to ask: how can we make these things better for kids and families? And the first thing I would say is, yes, they should be targeted toward lower income families who legitimately need them. There are some versions of successful voucher systems that have created opportunities for special needs children to go to schools that specialize in their special need. Now, that's an exception. Most kids using vouchers do not have a special need, and they lose any services for that special academic need when they take a voucher. But you can design systems, and there have been some success that would allow, for example, attending a school for the deaf, for example, or hard of hearing. And then any existing voucher system that does just have a general use component, not for income or not for special needs, but it should follow the same public reporting requirements that public schools have to face. If this is all about helping kids and families and isn't about standing up, right-wing religious ideology, if it's just about helping kids and families, then there shouldn't be any problem asking the voucher schools to follow the same testing and public reporting requirements, financial disclosures, and so on and so forth that public schools have to face. And the evidence actually suggests that outcomes do improve when you ask private schools taking voucher payments to report their test scores. Shocker, the light of day makes those test scores go up. So those would be the things I would stress. Focus first on kids who need the dollars for low-income families. Focus on public reporting and accountability and oversight for those taxpayer funding, and hold those voucher schools accountable in the same exact way that we try to hold public schools accountable for the results.
It almost sounds like that school choice and vouchers specifically were sort of an idea that initially was based on this idea of transparency and competition and accountability, but that it got hijacked by folks who had very different goals and motivations. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Partly fair. It's always been a right-wing political movement, dating back again to the months following Brown versus Board of Education, when opponents of racial integration jumped on voucher programs as a way to get out of having to integrate their schools. But certainly over time, like any political policy, any political movement, there are different folks in different sides of the aisle. A co-sponsor of the first voucher bill in Milwaukee was a Democratic legislator who thought this might be a good idea to help kids in her community in Milwaukee. She since disavowed the voucher movement of today. Before she passed away, she rejected using these funds at religious schools for religious education. But it's certainly true that that good faith efforts have been made and have included voucher type systems over time to improve outcomes. And listen, there are plenty of examples in public policy of creating strong public-private partnerships with community-based providers, things like childcare, community services, after-school care, food services, right? That also including partner with church groups. But they all have accountability, they all have oversight, and they all are directed toward people who actually need the help and need the intervention, and not just wealthy families. And so, when we're talking about using taxpayer dollars to fund a program like school vouchers, where 70% of the voucher users were already in private school to begin with, it's very difficult to kind of get, on board with the idea that there's a really well-meaning intent here to help kids and families. A lot of this is just a new taxpayer subsidy for existing private school choices.
I guess when I pull back and I think about the goal more generally of K through 12 education is to create obviously an informed citizenry. And so when I look at the United States compared to other developed countries, I think like a lot of folks see a lot to be concerned about. There's this, you're familiar with it, I'm sure, this international comparison thing called PISA, which measures critical thinking of 15-year-olds in math, science, and reading. The U.S. is in like 18th place. China is number 2 overall. Japan's better. South Korea, Canada, the UK are better. I mean, so it seems to me that if we compare ourselves to more or less other, large, wealthy countries, or sometimes not even so wealthy countries like China, at least on a per capita basis, we've got some problems. And I can understand people looking at that and saying, well, geez, if most kids are getting their education through public schools and we're falling so far behind, maybe vouchers are a solution. And I guess I'm trying to sort of put that all together in my head, because I'm sure you look at those international comparisons and are concerned as well, right?
Well, they don't. But the problem here is that, listen, public schools can always find room for improvement. And the problem, though, here, if we're just going to talk about academic outcomes, is that vouchers are far worse than the problem we're trying to solve. Again, over the last decade, when we look at the academic results for children who leave public schools to take a voucher, they're overwhelmingly going to low-quality private schools with far worse test scores than the public schools the children were leaving, and the academic results show this. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that these test score drops for those individual kiddos who leave those public schools and go to these subprime private schools with a voucher are worse on average than what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores in Louisiana, or what COVID-19 more recently did to test scores there. The reason is they're going to schools that are not overly interested in academic outcomes. So if we're going to talk about PISA, or we're going to talk about other international comparisons, or we're going to talk about what public schools need to do to improve their outcomes, let's have that conversation. All for it. All I want to stress here is that vouchers are not the solution to that problem. We also know, by the way, that test scores can gain very quickly and sustain themselves over time with direct new investments in public education. So if we're going to talk about improving educational outcomes, especially in low-income communities, the first solution has to be, listen, you get what you pay for, okay? We're going to skimp on those low-income communities, especially in some of the states that are passing voucher bills today, by the way, places like Florida, places like Texas. Then we're going to get poor results. And it's not an accident that the states that have made new commitments to their public school communities, especially their low-income and under-resourced communities, see the biggest academic gains.
I wanted to ask you about the funding question, because I know that you've been a researcher in this area for a while and know a lot more than I do, sure. But based on the data that I've seen, somewhere around 47.5% of school funding comes from state governments, around 45% from local governments, and most of that is property taxes generally. And the rest, which is, if you do that math, a very small amount, is federal funding. And so if that model is correct, if those numbers are more or less correct, those percentages, is that a good funding model for public schools, do you think?
The state piece of that breakdown is the most important when it comes to equalizing access to resources for kids. Because of that breakdown that you're describing, where so much of the rest of it comes from local tax base and property values, it's really the state piece that's important. And it's also the state piece that's lost when vouchers come to town. So I don't know, that we've got an ideal funding model for all public school districts, but I do know that the state piece is the most important for equity and for equal opportunity. And it is the piece that's lost when vouchers are passed at the state legislature.
And let's say, I am sure that there would be stark differences in K through 12 education policy between a second Trump administration and a Harris administration. What would you expect to be the biggest differences when it comes to school choice and vouchers?
Well, 2 of the first 3 paragraphs in Project 2025 demand universal school vouchers. That's the right-wing education agenda for staffing a new Trump term. Trump's own platform in the education section, the first sentence calls for universal vouchers. The next 2 demand, it's actually hard to make quite sense of what they're calling for, but they're attacking things that they call gender ideology and critical race theory and stuff like that. And they want to roll back the U.S. Department of Education, which is the most important source of monitoring discrimination and lack of opportunity at the federal level for K-12 kids. So the biggest difference here would be one candidate would want to double down on school vouchers and on rolling back protections against discrimination, and the other candidate is on record strongly opposing both rolling back the U.S. Department of Education, but also private school vouchers that discriminate. So I think it's a pretty clear choice there.
Yeah, I wanted to also get into, I mentioned that 90-something% of the funding for schools, K through 12 schools, comes at the state and local level. And so some people might say, well, is this a federal issue at all? Does it really matter if, say, Betsy DeVos is Secretary of Education opposed to someone else when it comes to school choice, since so much of this seems to be going on at the state level? So can you talk a little bit about why or why not the federal presence and push about this matters?
Yeah, the federal, well, it's true that the U.S. Department of Ed can do or say very little on vouchers per se, right? At least as current law would have it. But Republicans every year try to create a universal voucher tax credit through the tax code, which would basically incentivize parents to leave public schools, even in states that didn't have vouchers paid for by the states. They would use federal dollars. Essentially, a tax credit is basically an expenditure that the government makes to get behind a policy. So there are some federal money that could be spent on a federal voucher type program, regardless of who is the Department of Education secretary. But I take the position that at the federal level, the most important and the biggest threat to public schools is not Congress, but is the Supreme Court, because the political right at this moment, they have said, Betsy DeVos herself has said in exit interviews from her time as secretary, and other court cases are currently making their way through the judiciary system right now, looking for a new Supreme Court ruling that would make vouchers mandatory in every state as an issue of quote unquote religious freedom. So if we're talking about the federal level, it's actually the judiciary that I'm watching right now, as opposed to kind of a particular agency or particular line item in the federal budget.
That's really interesting to me, that religious freedom argument, because it suggests, I guess, I'm trying to follow the convoluted logic here, but the idea that somehow because of your right to practice the religion of your choice, you also have a right to have the federal government fund the religious education of your choice.
Or states fund it, yeah. So the convoluted logic goes something like this. It goes something like, well, for some folks, religious education is a fundamental part of practicing their religion. And by only funding public schools, a state is unfairly burdening those religious families by making them pay out of pocket for religious education when they should also have access to public funds to exercise education the way that their religion says. And that is the logic that these folks are trying to get the Supreme Court to weigh in on. And, I think this current court with its current makeup, with the 6 conservative justices who just rolled back Roe versus Wade, I think they will get this absolutely an attentive audience when they make this case there, but it's not there yet. We'll see what happens.
I'll call it an interesting argument and leave it at that. But so I always like to try to close on an optimistic note whenever possible. Yeah. And so when you look at the landscape that you've been very closely observing for a while now, what are the things that give you cause for even cautious optimism when it comes to vouchers?
Well, the best disinfectant is the light of day. We know now more than ever before how dangerous these programs are for kids. And I'm not the only one that's talking about this or knows this. And I do still believe in the importance of evidence and the importance of data to make a difference in creating strong communities and strong public policies that benefit everyone. So I am optimistic in that sense. We also know, by the way, what types of things do work in public schools. And it isn't just curriculum, and it isn't just having a great teacher, although having a good curriculum and having a great teacher are obviously really important. It's other stuff that may seem obvious to listeners, but we're just now really establishing firmly in the research community. Like, for example, we've got a big heat wave right now across the country. We know that hot children learn less well in schools. So investing in proper air conditioning and heating in the winter, ventilation systems. We just came through a airborne pandemic. Ventilation systems help. You know what else works? School meals. So hungry children learn less well. As any parent will tell you, when their 7-year-old is starving, they don't focus as well. Hungry children learn less well. Start times at schools. We know that sleepy children don't learn as well. So rethinking kind of when we start school every day, particularly for teenagers. And then, there's a variety of other add-ons to this that just sort of create what we call in the research community whole child efforts, understanding that kids come into classrooms as people, not as little properties of their parents, and try to invest in who these kids are as whole people, whole children, and thinking about their future trajectories, not just what they're not exposed to and worried about what book they might read or worried that they might have a gay teacher. But let's talk about what these kids' futures look like. Let's feed them. Let's keep them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Let's make sure that they have safe places to walk during the school day. These are all pieces of what I think a positive looking agenda would move forward on. And it happens to be evidence-based too, as far as the research is concerned.
And I would expect that it's the sort of thing that an investment in that would in fact be an investment, because what we would get back in return, a much better educated electorate or citizenry, would well exceed the cost if we did this at least in a fairly, a reasonable type of way.
Well, they call it low-hanging fruit, right? Like, I mean, I don't, it's fairly direct, straightforward things that turn out to really matter a lot for both, not just to make the child healthier, but also if we're just talking about academics, they actually have payoffs too on things like test scores, as it turns out.
All right. And, we only really have been able to scratch the surface, but The Privateers is a fascinating book. I learned a lot, and, a lot of policy books can be kind of a slog to get through. This is totally not that. So I would say if you're at all interested in vouchers and the whole history of it, eye-opening stuff, well worth reading The Privateers. And Josh Cowan, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter-exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff, is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,